So, we are rounding quickly into Game 3 of the release of the Xbox 360, and I have to say, I am starting to rather enjoy going back to such a different era of games. There's so much already that has become standard practice, paired with so much wild stuff from this bygone era, developmental paths forgotten or given up on, parts of games we have lost and parts we have done well to lose. Each game has been surprising in its own right, and it truly feels more of a, well, Wild West of an era. There are some trends that dominate the console, but there is also a lot of fresh and new ideas at this stage. Today's game is Gun, the Wild West shooter by Neversoft. That's right, the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater guys. Really is a wild ride for a few good reasons, and so many that have become rather dated. And that's putting it mildly. It honestly predicts so much of what made Red Dead a hit only a few years later, but really comes with a lot of baggage. Our story of this game will take us through game publishers, Neversoft's history, and even a surprising ARG, or augmented reality game for those who do not know. For a little bit of context, the video that's just played in the background is the intro to Gun. We'll come back to that later though. Let's start with Activision, a company that is finding it hard to stay out the headlines with multiple allegations of mismanagement, sexual misconduct, and just generally being in the spotlight for how large corporations often have power structures that sideline and take advantage of people. Reading and writing histories, especially ones that by necessity have a large focus on companies, the big games of this era were pretty much always made by one, leads to some level of valorization. When you start doing a bit of reading, you get a lot of stories about business talk, hostile buyouts and huge sales consistently during this period. But conversations of the teams making the games are less in the mix. It's also a period that has a press that's very focused in one of two directions, either industry news or review and purchasing guides, with both being written for two very different audiences. If you're lucky, the studio may have done their own documentary on the era. Rare had one of these with Cameo. This also comes with its own obvious biases. They control the narrative after all. That all being said, these things are still a part of the history and an important one to tell. But just as important is for me to bring context to yourself. It is all the history of games after all. That comes with all the mess and baggage of today with it. We cannot forget about this active story with Activision, but it is still an active story. I have struggled to tie it back to the era we are talking about concretely, even if some of the allegations certainly are housed in the past. Just know that Activision is not the hero of this story, or any story really, and that we should think critically about these large corporations. Publishers in a game sense are facilitators, or at least this is how I've seen them describe themselves. We have yet to talk about them so far in this history series, so I think it's worth doing so. They're there for a number of key factors, differing from publisher to publisher. They take on the risk and fund the games, help guide development. They are able to have a network of specialists to help out with things like audio design. They help find and put talent in games, they market and distribute games. And this is all just to name a few jobs, and it all comes with the motivation of a big profit at the end. There's not really a standardised role for them in the industry, but they have become key to the way that we think and talk about games. People often point to someone like EA before looking at the actual devs themselves. Both a pro and a con depending on that week's particular news story. It's an important distinction to make and one that's always evolving, but that is how Activision fits into today's story, as a publisher. So, Activision. I'm not going to go into too much depth with Activision, but I'd like to give a bit of perspective on them. They're a company that pretty much came straight out of the era of Atari, very early video game history, the 1970s. 4 people at Atari were responsible for about 60% of the sales, and when they looked around they realised that a huge amount of money from these games was going back to Atari. Essentially, they would be taken advantage of. Activision then became one of the factors involved in the video game crash, so we're jumping forward to about 1983, where the valuation of a single game plummeted, becoming incredibly cheap and financially inviable for a lot of the companies making them. Activision were basically the first company to bring games to the Atari that were not first party published, another way of saying not published by Atari themselves. This led to a whole host of other companies trying to repeat this success, often with lesser quality, eventually driving down the sales of games. They were no longer valued as highly by the general public due to poor quality. One interesting note along this historical line is the infamous dump of cartridges for E.T. in 1983. where the value of the cartridges became so low that people decided to basically dump them instead of actually trying to do anything with them. So moving forward a few years, after making business decisions that benefited themselves, Activision were in the position to start being able to publish other developer studios. This is where today's subject comes in. You see, Activision started to make it as part of their house styles to get games released annually, usually ready for the Christmas holiday season. This wasn't standard practice back in the day, and they wanted to try and corner the market here. Leading up to Gun and Neversoft, they sort of went on this rampant spending session, picking up people like Treyarch, Infinity Ward and Red Octane. And this is how Neversoft themselves became an Activision studio, and Activision became more of a publisher than a developer. They rarely make games after the year 2000. Neversoft themselves, right, we should probably talk about them. Their initial start was developing a game called Skeleton Warriors, based on a short-lived cartoon. Funnily enough, the game got released in 1996, about 2 years after the first release of the cartoon, which by this stage was over. So this probably limited the amount of profit that it could make off this game. It's a side-scrolling hack and slash with sick music and not a huge amount of finesse, although I don't think this is completely unusual in this era. It really is striking how much tighter the mechanics of games are developed these days, at least from what I can tell from watching a short video or two comparing. From here they were asked to port over MDK in 1996, a game for the PC to the PlayStation. For me, it's here you can start tracing some of the actual similarities to Gun, with a third-person camera and a first-person zoom in to shoot. My understanding is that porting games in this era was very difficult, taking an incredible amount of work to get where they needed to be on different hardware. This process drains a lot of their money, leaving them on the verge of collapse. So this is where our two components we've talked about mesh. A lucky meeting with Activision, while lucky at the time, meant a contract to build a couple of games by Neversoft, with the most famous being a skateboarding game in 1999. This of course is the famous Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, game to which a sequel, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, I have a very fond memories of. Now if you have any knowledge of the history of games, even if by osmosis, you will know this one. And funnily enough, when you get such a big famous game, it's often because they had pretty decent sales. This is sort of where the company took off and found their own bread and butter title. But this did produce a negative effect. You know when I said that the meeting with Activision was a lucky one for now? Well, they got bought out. It's still not an issue here, but if you continue this story forward to 2014, they get merged with various Call of Duty studios. Neversoft was no more. Just to add a little more context to the situation, from what I can tell with buyouts, you get the sense that they provide a certain level of stability for studios, even opportunities for growth. And at the end of the day, people do not exist just to make games. It can secure the lives and jobs of many, even if it does lose some direct control. So, 6 years of developing Tony Hawk's, presumably Neversoft wanted to try their hands at something different. In 2004, they announced Gun. You can follow the announcement news, first the major thing being that it's not a skating game, then that it's a western, and then the gameplay. It's fun watching journalists of the past trying to put all this information together. It ends up being this cross-platform, cross-generation western game, and you can tell it is cross-generation. It really does feel like a PS2 game. But it was seen on all the consoles of the time, even ending up with a PSP port. One last thing before we get into the game itself. Alongside its release there was an ARG, or augmented reality game, called Last Call Poker. These games tend to mix real life with the digital to create a sort of game for people to play. From what I can tell, there are only a couple of sources that mention it, but it seems like it was a set of online poker games. These then culminated in a meetup of players at 6 different cemeteries across the US, supposedly the favourite of a fictional millionaire, Lucky Lionel. I too, a normal person, have favourite cemeteries. At these meetups people chatted and played more poker. There's one very earnest description of this meetup in the sources that draws something special from this social interaction shared by similar-minded people. A simpler time maybe. People then earn a few prizes by playing poker. It was actually an alternative rule set for this entire game called Tombstone Poker. I have had a look, but I've not managed to find any of the rules for it, which is unfortunate. This then led into a treasure hunt in whichever city they were in. It has a very Cub Scout or corporate bonding sounding construction to me, but also provides it in a way to connect, even if it is essentially a piece of advertising. It also seems at one stage to provide some light theatre, with Lucky Lionel's supposed granny showing up to shout a few words before driving away in a car. I call this a simpler time. I'm not sure if this sort of thing would gather loads of people these days. I'm not sure if people will be as into this. And I'm not sure anyone but the biggest titles could build such a large thing as well, as ARGs seem to have gone into much more online fairs. But people really get something out of these also. My primary source for the last Call ARG is a website called arg.net, so they're likely to be slightly more in favour of this style of interconnectivity outside of digital spaces. But that short description that I talked about is very endearing in lots of ways. It's very earnest. One last note on the ARG. It was created by the horribly titled 42 Entertainment, known for creating many of these ARGs, including one for Halo 2 called I Love Bees. This seemingly was also very popular. It's something I completely missed back in the day, but it told the story of this stranded AI. ARGs are a bit of a side note to games, but an interesting one that seemed to somehow mesh very well with games specifically. I'm probably a little too cynical to get taken all the way in with these things, and I tend to see them as mostly advertising, but there's some really interesting stuff going on with, I think, Inscription at the moment as well, and it seems to be a great way to develop a community.
So you may notice that the video ends here, and it doesn't normally end here, it normally goes into the gameplay. Well, it's taken me a long time to get this video done and edited, and you may notice that I'm spending a bit more time on the editing process, getting it a bit nicer and a bit more professionally done. I hesitate to use that word because I don't think this is particularly professional, but it's going to be nicer. That being said, I'm going to try an experiment with splitting these videos into 2 parts for now, for the near future, and hopefully that just means a more consistent release schedule with them. Thank you for watching. My name's been Billy. Goodbye.